Hey everybody, welcome back to Digital Wood Carver. My name is Laney Shaughnessy, and in this video I'm going to walk you through a bit of a fix-it how-to for the DWC2440. From time to time, as we own our CNC machines, we may have to do some minor fixes and repairs, whether it be on the outside of the unit or within the control box. Now in this video, I'm going to walk you through how to replace an access cable connector. On the front of our control box here, I've got 3 access cables, X, Y, and Z, and sometimes A if you have a 4th axis unit. And at the end of these motor cables is a connector. It's a 4-pin connector. Now, my X axis 4-pin connector, one of the pins has shorted out. And there are 4 wires that create 2 pairs, 2 directionals. And if you lose one of the directions, or if you lose one of your pins and things, your CNC axis, that particular axis that has shorted out, won't know which way to go. So the unit just kind of sits there and oscillates in one place. And, you know, that's a good indication that your indicator has short out or gone bad. And in my case, it is my cable connector. One of the pins has in fact shorted out and gone bad. I can look down here and see it and everything. Now I'm going to walk you through how to replace the access cable connector, as well as, this is the female side of it, as well as the male side in the control box. And we're going to have to do some soldering. There's 4 wires that we're going to have to solder onto the new connector. Now, if you're not familiar with soldering and things like that, don't panic. It's not that big of a deal. Soldering is pretty straightforward. You can get simple solder kits from places like Lowe's, Home Depot, Harbor Freight, Amazon, and things like that. I've got just a very inexpensive soldering kit from Harbor Freight. It works just fine for me. No worries there. And so, you know, I have it just on hand for occasions like this. If something were electronic that needed to be repaired, I have the tools necessary to do that, to keep my CNC up and running, you know, strong. Now, one of the things I will say that is handy to have when you're working with things like that is something that they call a third hand. It's one of these little devices here that have some little gator clips on it. And it's great for clamping onto wires and things to help hold the part while you're working on it and stuff. You know, my little kit that I got came with one of these. So, you know, handy to have around, because sometimes you're trying to hold the soldering iron and the solder and the wire, and you know, it can get a little fidgety and stuff. And so having a third hand or something like that, you know, something like this is very helpful, right? So let's talk about some of the tools that we're going to need to replace an access cable connector, both on the cable itself and inside the box. I'm going to change both of them out. One thing that I'm going to need is a pair of side cutters here, and that's going to allow me to cut the zip ties on the cable connectors to separate them. A small Phillips screwdriver, a little micro Phillips screwdriver, because on the connector there are 3 small Phillips screwdrivers that we, or screws, 3 small Phillips screws that we need to take out to get this connector onto the cable and things. Some solder, a soldering iron, like I said, a third hand would be helpful. A pair of wire strippers, you know, something that can accommodate the small wires and stuff. And I also like to have a notepad and pencil handy, because these connectors are numbered. And at the tip of the connector here, there's numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we need to identify the color wire that's on 1, 2, 3, or 4. There's red, white, black, and green. And we need to know which wire is on which pin, and we need to write that down, so when we're putting it back and soldering it all back together, we make sure we solder the correct wire on the correct pin. So that's really all there is as far as tools. You'll need a Phillips screwdriver to open up the control box if you have to do anything within the control box. If you're simply just replacing a cable connector, just the one end and not the other, then all you'll need is that little Phillips screwdriver, your soldering gun, and new connector. Now, the 4-pin motor cable connectors, you can find them at digitalwoodcarver.com on our website under replacement parts. And it's nice to have a few of those on hand in case you ever needed to replace them. Now, in earlier model digital woodcarver 2440s, we had a 9-pin connector. And so this video is not going to cover the replacement 9-pin connector. We'll make a video for that later down the road. But for the newer models, I would say probably 2018, possibly and up, they were changed to 4-pin cable connectors. I don't know exactly the year that they switched over, but we have our 4-pin cable connectors. So we are going to get set up, and we're going to replace my X-axis cable connector, and I'm going to take you along for the journey step by step. All right. Okay, so on the front of the control box here, we have our male part of that connector, that 4-pin connector. We have our cable connector, female end that's connected to the motor axis cable. And then the male end, we have X, Y, and Z. And if you have a 4th axis unit, you have an A axis here. Now, these connectors are connected to the front of the control box. Here is a look at one of the connectors out of the box here. There is a lock nut that needs to be removed so that connector can come out of the box. And the wires that are currently on there, the 4 wires, your red, white, black, and green, they travel into the unit to one of the motor drivers. And if you have a 3-axis, you'll have 3 motor drivers in the unit. If you have a 4-axis, you'll have 4 of them. You'll need to trace your connector wire to its prospective motor driver, and you will disconnect the other end of that cable so we can pull it out of the box to replace it or resolder a new connector on it. Now, let's take a close look at the motor drivers. I'm going to turn the box, and we'll set these motor cables down here for a moment. Okay, here's a look at one of the motor drivers, and over here is where our connector cable comes into on this motor driver. And these 4 wires, the red, white, black, and green, they're labeled A+, A-, B+, and B-. And as we can tell from this connector, the red wire comes into A+, the white into A-, the black into B+, and the green into B-. And that should be consistent throughout the units, but you definitely want to just make sure and confirm which wire is on there. A good way to be able to keep track of things is take photographs with your cell phone, or use a pen or paper and write it down so you know. Now, my X-axis cable travels through and comes over to my X-axis here, which is this wire back here in this driver. So I will remove that with the little flathead screwdriver there. I'll remove those cables so I can pull that connector out and get ready to replace it. And sorry about the blurry screen, but the camera has a hard time picking up on those micro areas and everything there. All right, so let's go ahead and get our connector cable disconnected and pull it out so we can replace it. So now I've traced my connector cable back to this back left driver here. And you may think to yourself, oh Lord, how do I get the screwdriver in there to take those wires out? Well, these green terminals on the top of the motor driver, they unplug. So I'm going to reach back here and I'm going to unplug the connector here so that I can get to the terminals to remove that wire. So we just need a small flathead screwdriver, and I'm going to loosen these screws. And I'm going to pull those wires out. Okay. Now I can remove the lock nut on the back of the connector here and pull out that assembly. As I'm removing this and everything, I want to be careful that I don't unplug any other wires or anything like that to get that assembly out. Okay, so here is our connector taken out and everything. Now we're going to reuse the wire. We're just replacing the connector. The lock ring and nut that came off of it, just set that aside. Nice to keep them in our little spare toolbox in case we ever need them, but the new connector comes with a new lock ring and little lock nut and stuff. Now, on the back of this connector, this 4-pin connector, if we turn it around, well, before we turn it around, let's look inside here. And at the top, if I can get things to focus in, let's see if I can help the camera out a bit. At the top of this connector, there is a little key so that the female can only slide in one way. That key is located right at the tip of my finger there. And if we turn the connector around so we can see where the wires are soldered on, and we have that key facing up, on the back here, if you look very closely, each of the pins, the 4 pins, are numbered 1, which is the top right, 2, which is the bottom right, 3 is the bottom left, and 4 is the top left. And so we want to identify what wires are on what pins. And in my case, I'm going to take my notepad here. You can also take a photo with your cell phone, but I'm going to write down my 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so number 1 is my red wire. Number 2 is the white wire. Number 3 is the black wire. And number 4 is the green wire. Okay. And so I've got that written down. Now I know which wire to put back onto the new connector. All right. So now we're going to get set up to do some soldering and do that replacement. Once I get this replaced and installed back in, then we're going to switch over to the cable connector and do that. So we're going to do one at a time. Now, a lot of times you do not have to replace the male connector just because you're replacing the cable connector. However, it may be a good idea because when that pin shorted out, it could have damaged the male pin in here. And on my male pin, I have some discoloration and everything. So I'm going to go ahead and replace both ends. And when you get a new cable connector assembly, you will get both the male and the female part of that connector when you buy that replacement part. All right, so let's go ahead and get set up here, and we'll remove this old connector from our wires, and we'll get ready to replace and solder on the new connector. Okay, so the first thing that I need to do is go ahead and remove the connector, the old connector from our wire harness here. And I'm just going to desolder those wires and take them off. I really don't want to cut this unless I absolutely need to, but I don't want to, you know, sacrifice any length to this if I don't have to. And so I've got my soldering iron warming up. I've got my solder, and I've got my third hand here, which is going to be handy to kind of help me, you know, hold some things while I work on it and stuff. So I'm just going to very simply desolder this connector and remove it, clean up the wires, re-tin them. Tin them is where we take some solder and put a little solder on the copper and get them ready to go into the new connector that I have here and all. So we'll go ahead and let's test our soldering iron. There we go. Okay, there's my green wire disconnected. My red wire. black wire there. And my last wire is my white one. Let me reach under this way. I'm a southpaw, left-handed, so things are a bit awkward for me. So now I've got the old connector off. We're going to go ahead and discard that and not keep it around. But I am going to keep the lock ring and nut. You never know when you'll need a spare one of those or something. So I'll keep those at handy. Now, the end of my wires here, the end of my wires and everything, they already have some solder on them. They're already tinned, but I'm going to go ahead and clean them up a bit and re-tin them. Now, notice that we don't have a whole lot of length of wire sticking out of here. We don't want a whole lot of wire sticking out of there and things. We want to kind of keep things tight and handy, but that does kind of create, you know, a bit of an obstacle when you're working with, especially if you have big hands and things. So just keep that in mind. Now, to clean up the wires and all, I'm going to spread them out so I can work with them. And I'm going to take my soldering iron and just warm up that solder that's on there and just smooth it out. If you need to re-tin them and add additional solder to them and stuff, go ahead and do so. In my case, I have plenty of solder on them. I'm just smoothing it out, some of the little bumps and ridges and stuff. And also, we've got some nice, clean, tinned wires and all. And so if we take a look at that, we've got some just nice tinning on there. The black wire looks a little fat, but that'll get spread out when I put it in the new connector. All right, so now the fun part is the new connector. And make sure you don't get the new connector confused with the old one. Like I said, discard that old one. We don't want to accidentally resolder the old one back on, right? Because they look identical. So get rid of that old one. And I'm going to go ahead and get this held into place with that third arm, third hand. All right, and I'm going to get ready to solder these on. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of solder to these wells here, the little cups and everything. So I'm going to take some of my solder here, and I don't want to distribute a whole lot of solder in there, but just enough to kind of fill those wells. Let me get this turned upright here. And I want to kind of work in, and I wish I had a better zoom on my camera so that you could get a real micro close-up of what is happening here. Okay, so in each one of the connectors, I've added a little puddle of solder to fill those wells. And when I am heating the wires and everything, I want them to kind of fall right into those little cups to, you know, hold real nicely. Now, looking back at my notes, Remember I said I'm going to be doing my 2 bottom pins, which is pin number 2 and pin number 3. Pin number 3 is on the left here. Pin number 2 is my white wire, and pin number 3 is my black wire. I've got my little notepad here where I've written that down. And so I want to be working with my white and my black wire. Okay, so with my white and black wires connected, now I can focus on my red and green, and red is going to be pin number 1, that's the top right, and green is going to be pin number 4, that's the top left. Okay, so with the new connector soldered on into place, I'm going to take some heat shrink tubing, and I'm just going to slide that up just to give a little bit of protection to this. You'll need like a hot air gun or a lighter of some sort. And in my soldering kit, I have a lighter for the heat shrink. So we can just get that on there. And I'm going to slide another piece on to cover these areas. You don't need to, not necessary. It's not really necessary in things, but it's you know, something that I want to do for my cables. So I'm going to take this heat shrink and want to make sure that I get the right tube size. Okay, so I've got 2 different sizes of shrink wrap here, and this one's going to kind of go over the end of the connector there. Again, this is not necessary, but I want to go ahead and for my connections, I want to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to get that to shrink down around those connectors. And a hot air gun, don't let, if you're going to use a lighter or that kind of heat instead of a hot air gun, don't concentrate the heat in too many areas, or you could get bubbling and things. I mainly just want to just make it look nice and clean and tidy. All right, so with that, we can go ahead and get this back into the control box and hook back up, and this side is done. Okay, now I need to focus on my motor cable connector, and I've got to, before I can remove the old connector, I need to remove the 3 Phillips screws. So we have 2 right here on the back, and then right here in the middle of the body under the lock ring, slide that lock ring back, and you'll see there's another little Phillips screwdriver. And again, the focus is not going to be able to pick up on that too well, but we've got a little Phillips screw there. And so, all right, once your 3 screws are removed, this black tip here slides out of the barrel body, and the connection, the wire connections are on the end of this black tip here. And this is a twist lock. There's a little groove and everything that this barrel body has to twist, and then it slides back. And for now, we're just going to slide it back on the cable. But when we get this old connector removed from the end of the wires there, we'll slide this barrel body off, and we'll slide the new barrel body on. Now, does that make a difference? Does it necessary and everything? Not really. I just, you know, if I'm replacing the connector, I'm just going to replace the whole connector and not just parts of it. Pin number 4 on my connector. Let's see if you guys and girls can see that a little bit. Pin number 4 is the one that's shorted out. You can see the silver sleeves in pins 1, 2, and 3, if I can get that camera to focus again. But pin 4 is the one that's shorted out. You can tell that the silver sleeve is missing out of there and stuff. Okay, so now I can look at my solder connections and identify the wires that are on each pin. I don't want to take for granted that it's the same wires on the same pins as the male connector, same colors and stuff. But for the most part, I could probably be pretty confident that it is. So pin number 1 is red. Pin number 2 is white. Pin number 3 is black. And pin number 4 is green. So they are the same, but you don't want to, take that for granted. So again, you can take photos if you need to, and it's hard to see in this lighting and everything, the numbers on the end of the connector, but there are numbers next to each of the holes on the connector. And I wish that the camera would pick it up a little bit better, but there are numbers imprinted on the end of that connector and everything, and we can identify the pin that goes to that connector and the wire. And so red, white, black, and green, 1, 2, 3, and 4. I can go ahead and desolder these wires off. All right. I've got my old connector off. I've got the wires cleaned up and re-tinned, ready to connect. I've got the new barrel body for my connector. I've got the new barrel body slid on the cable. And now I want to go ahead and slide some shrink wrap tubing on the cable as well that I can use once everything is soldered together. I can use that shrink wrap and, cover the back of this connector. Now, on the connector, we're not going to be able to clip the connector into the third hand here that's helping me out and holding these wires and all. So I'm going to be using the little gator clip to clip the wire while I'm working with this. And I'm going to be working with this kind of with 2 fingers, and then my other hand is going to be, controlling the soldering iron. Now, I want to make sure that my shrink wrap tube is big enough that's going to be able to go over the back part of this connector here. So let's see what I've got. All right, so I have a little bit bigger shrink tube here for up near the connector, and then I have a smaller one that is, for around the cable. And I've doubled up this one to give it a little bit of rigidity. I've got 2 of them stuck inside of the other. Not really necessary, but I like to have a little bit of rigidity up here near the end of the connector and stuff. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and slide that down out of the way. Let's get our cables ready to work with. And again, red is going to be my number 1. White is number 2. Black is number 3. And green is number 4. So I want to go ahead and get these somewhat in order here that I'm working with. And now this is a bit of a balance act. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a slight bend in the wire here and get it over my number 1 well. Now I've already added some solder into the ends of this, and how I did that was I've carefully gripped the connector lightly with the gator clip. It's a very fat connector, so the gator clip barely holds it on. And I've deposited some solder into each of those well areas and kind of pre-tinned them and everything. And just rotated this around as I needed to get that solder in those wells. So now with that, I can go ahead and grip my cable. Make sure my connector is facing the right way. And number one is here. That's my red wire. So I'm going to move the other wires out of the way. Now, what I'm going to try to do here is I've got a slight bend in that red wire so that it kind of creates a bit of a down pressure because I'm going to be holding the connector underneath with my middle finger to kind of create pressure when I'm pushing down with the soldering iron. And my first finger is kind of back here on the wire to kind of guide it and everything. Now, we don't want to hold the soldering iron too long on, just enough to push it down into that solder and then let it cool. It's going to get a little warm on the fingertip, but just make sure you don't touch your finger with the end of that soldering iron and everything. So we're just going to, with it in position, we're going to get that centered and push down and then let go. Let it cool down. Make sure you don't have a cold joint, meaning that you can easily, pull it out. And everything looks good there. I'm ready to move on to my next wire. All right. So now with that connector soldered on, I can go ahead and I'm gonna let it cool a little bit. It's cool enough. Want to go ahead and inspect all my wires, make sure that there's no bare wires like, touching other wires and things like that. It should be nice and clean. And with that, I can go ahead and I'll pull the first tube, a shrink tube, up and over here. I'm not going to go over the full connector. Now, don't do that. Just over this back part here, the wires. And then my smaller shrink tube, I'm going to have that come up and go inside of that a bit, like so. You can use a hot air gun or a lighter or whatever you have to heat this heat shrink up and go from there. All right, so once everything is cool and ready to go, now we can start the reassembly. So the barrel body just slides on, and there's a groove on the back side and a little dimple in the connector. We want that to slide on into place, and then it twists. When it twists, our hole should line up where our small screw is, or where our small screw goes, and make sure that everything is seated nicely. And then we got a very tiny, very, very tiny Phillips screw. I don't know if y'all can see that, but it's super tiny. Could easily get lost in things. But that's the screw that goes into this hole. And okay, so with that screwed back on, we need to put the back piece to the connector on and those two screws. All right, make sure all your screws are nice and tight. Don't over torque them or strip them and all. They're really small. But with that, we have just replaced a 4-pin access cable connector. And we're ready to connect everything back up on our control box and get back into operation. So let's go ahead and do that now. All right, so back at the control box, I'm going to go ahead and feed my connector cable through and put my lock ring and nut on. And the little key here, I want it facing the same way as the other keys on the other connectors, which is to the right side. I'm going to go ahead and push that new connector into place. Just snaps in there. All right, and when you're pushing on that, just be gentle. Don't pull on the wires back here. We don't want to pull them off their connection and things. And then we're going to tighten up our lock ring. All right, so now with that front connector connected, I can take the other end and screw it back to my terminal. And the wires where they go A positive, A negative, B positive, B negative. My A positive was red, my A negative was white, B positive was black, and B negative was green. So I want to make sure that I get them in the correct spots. Make sure that when you're securing these screws down, that you are screwing down on the wire itself, not the sheathing of the wire. You know, you want a good connection. So with all of those secured, I can go ahead and plug the connector back into the top of the driver. All right. So now we're ready to put the cover back on the box, and we can then attach our cable connectors, our XYZ cable connectors, and do our zip tying and cable management where we had to cut the zip ties to separate the cable wires and all. We can go ahead and get that cable management done. And we're back in business. All right, folks. Well, that wraps up this Fix It How To. Once you have your box lid secured back on, you're ready to go ahead and get it back on the shelf and plug it in and get back into operation. I'm going to try to do some of these how to fix it videos for you, because from time to time we have to do maintenance and repairs on our CNC machines. And the access cable connectors, they're susceptible to needing repair from time to time. You know, depending on how much wear and tear, or if something shorts out, or a electrical storm. You know, there's so many possible reasons. But hopefully this video will help aid in guiding you through those steps. And it's not a very difficult thing. Soldering is not, you know, it's not rocket science. We just want to make sure that we have a good solder connection, not a cold joint. You can look that word up, cold joint, so you know what that means, solder cold joint. But we want to make sure we have a good connection, and just take our time. Make sure we get the wires in the correct locations on the correct pins, and we'll be good to go. Okay. All right, folks. Thank you very much for joining me, and until next time, I'll see you soon.